So in today's web dev tip, we're going to take a look at the JavaScript document.getElementById function, how it works, and also some of the alternatives that you can use. So I'm just over here on the Dev2 website, and I'm just going to quickly demonstrate what the document.getElementById function does. So if we have a look on the page, there's various different elements, as you'd expect, and some of them have got IDs assigned to them. So for example, this main one down here that holds all of the page content has an ID of page-content. So the function that we're going to use to do this, as mentioned, is document.getElementById, and the ID is called page content of that element, which simply returns us the HTML element on that page. So if we then want to actually make some changes to that element using our JavaScript, we've got access to it. So we could set its text content, for example, to be something else, and it will obviously replace that on the page. Generally, you want to do that in your JavaScript code to grab an element on the page to then make some changes to it, or to set up any event listeners as well. So what are the alternatives that you can use other than getElementById? Well, there is also the query selector function, which is something that's commonly used. And basically you can pop into here any type of CSS selector to select an element on the page. So for example, if we wanted to get the page content element again, we would this time pass in the hash, which is the CSS selector for an ID. So we're basically saying the same thing, get us the element that has the ID of page content. We can also pass in other CSS selectors as well. So for example, somewhere on the page here, there is a hamburger icon, which I think is currently hidden, but you can see that has a class of hamburger. So to actually grab that using our query selector, instead of passing in a hash, we pass in a dot, which is for a class in CSS, and just pass in hamburger. And you can see that's given us the hamburger element, so we can make any changes or set up any event listeners that we'd like on that particular element. So getElementById and query selector only actually return one specific element, but what if you want to get a group of elements on a page? Well, you can do that in two ways. The first is to use query selector all, which simply is an addition to the query selector function. And if we pass in a CSS selector into that, say we wanted to get all of the buttons on the page, we can simply pass in button as the selector. And you can see it returns back a list of button elements on the page. So the other way to do the same sort of thing is to use an older method, which is actually document.getElements_by_classname. Now this is a bit more restrictive than the query selector all, so before we just passed in a selector for a button element, but we need to actually pass in class names here, which are the CSS class names of elements on the page. So you might be able to just see here that some of the buttons here have got this crayons-button class, so we can select buttons using that particular class. And that will give us a similar type of list of elements on the page. It seems like we've got more there actually, so perhaps there are more elements that are using this crayons button class. But the same principle applies. If we want to get multiple elements on a page, we can either use query selector all, or we can use this getElementsByClassName. So now here's the million-dollar question: which is the function that you should be using, and which one performs best? It doesn't really matter which one you use really. They've obviously got different use cases as well. But if we go over and have a look at a benchmark, and looking at the results that we've got for the tests that we've run, you can see that getElementById performs the fastest within these tests, but it's not too much different from the query selector code, but it is about 10% slower in this particular run. Obviously getElementsByClassName, it's got more work to do. It's looking for all of the elements on a page that match a particular class. But where you can really notice a problem is with the query selector all function. And you can see it's performing quite a lot lower than the other functions within this particular test run. So there's the evidence to show you which function performs the best, but really it's not too much of a problem because you can see here these tests have been run 10,000 times each, so they are quite intensive, and chances are in a real world app you're not going to be running these functions over and over again like this. But it is interesting to note that if you've got the option to not use a query selector all function, for example, then you might make your app a bit more performant, especially if you've got multiple calls to that over time. So that's it for the getElementById function in JavaScript and some of the alternatives that you can use as well. Stay tuned for more web dev tips.